Imagine you're crouched beneath a rock overhang, watching the sky darken for hours. You've already moved everything deeper into the shelter, yesterday's meat, the tools, the animal hides. Then the rain begins. Not a light sprinkle. A full downpour. Within minutes, the ground turns to mud. The air grows so thick with water that you can barely see 20 feet ahead. And without anyone needing to say it out loud, you know you're not going anywhere today. No hunting. No gathering. No moving to the next camp. You're staying right here for as long as the rain decides to keep falling. That could mean hours. It could mean days. 15 other people are squeezed into the same small dry space. A fire crackles in the center. Someone's baby is crying. 2 children wrestle near the back of the shelter. And you? You've got nothing but time. For most of human history, rain wasn't simply weather. It could bring everything outside to a stop. And what people did during those long, wet, seemingly endless hours may have mattered far more than what they could accomplish beneath a clear sky. Today, an all-day downpour barely changes our plans. You're inside anyway. You have walls, electricity, a charged phone, food in the kitchen, and a roof that doesn't care how hard the rain falls. You might glance through the window, think, gross, and go back to scrolling. Maybe you open Spotify, put on some lo-fi music, make a cup of tea, and sink into the couch. Rain becomes ambience. White noise. An excuse to stay in your pajamas until 2 in the afternoon. You might even fall asleep to it. But 50,000 years ago, that same sound, the rain hammering against rocks and trees, the grey sky stretching overhead, meant something completely different. It meant you were entering a strange suspended state. The normal rhythm of survival had been interrupted. Ancient humans didn't have weekends. They didn't have vacation days. They couldn't order food, stream a movie, or spend an afternoon browsing their phones. But they had something else. Rain days. And rain days were different. Let's start with the most obvious effect. Rain could trap you. It didn't matter if you knew exactly where the herd was. It didn't matter if the fish were running or the berries were ripe. Once heavy rain arrived, staying put could become the safest choice. There were several reasons. First came visibility. Heavy rain can reduce your ability to see what's happening around you. In an environment filled with predators, that wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was a serious risk. You can't track an animal you can't see. Worse, you might not see the animal tracking you. Lions, leopards, and hyenas didn't stop hunting simply because the weather turned bad. Some predators could even take advantage of poor visibility when their prey had a harder time detecting movement. Then there was the ground beneath your feet. Wet ground is unstable ground. Rocks become slippery. Mud can hide holes. Roots turn into trip hazards. Today, a twisted ankle is painful. Back then, an injury could become something much more serious. If you couldn't run, climb, hunt, gather, or contribute to the group, your chances of surviving could drop dramatically. So why take the risk unless you absolutely had to? There was another problem. Energy. Your body uses energy to stay warm. When you're cold and soaked, maintaining your core temperature becomes harder. Walking through heavy rain could leave you wet, cold, and exhausted. Instead of returning to camp stronger, you might come back weaker. So sometimes the smartest move wasn't to keep moving. It was to wait. But humans are remarkably bad at doing nothing. Give us enough time with nothing demanding our attention, and we start looking for something to do. Our hands become restless. Our minds wander. We start solving problems that could have waited. And that instinct may help explain why periods of enforced inactivity were so valuable. Because when ancient people were stuck inside, they didn't simply sit around and stare at the fire. They worked. The archaeological record provides plenty of evidence for this. Caves and rock shelters across the world contain enormous quantities of stone flakes and other debris left behind by tool production. At Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, archaeologists found concentrated areas inside the cave where people made tools, likely while sitting near the fire. The debris accumulated over time. Someone would take a rough stone core and gradually transform it into something useful, a hand axe, a scraper, a sharp-edged tool. The process was repetitive. It required attention, and it took time. Exactly the kind of time you suddenly had when the weather made leaving the shelter difficult. Tool-making wasn't necessarily something reserved for rainy days, of course. People needed tools all the time, but long periods inside created an opportunity to repair, reshape, and prepare them without having to choose between maintenance and the demands of the outside world. A tool that worked yesterday might need attention before the next hunt. A dulled edge could be sharpened. A broken tool could be repaired. A rough piece of stone could become something more useful. Rain didn't create the need for technology. It created uninterrupted time to work on it, and stone wasn't the only material people were working with. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, researchers discovered evidence of ochre processing. Ochre had been ground into powder and associated with bone marrow and charcoal, with the material stored in abalone shells. Whatever the exact purpose of the mixture, the evidence points toward deliberate preparation rather than random use. Someone had collected the material. Someone had processed it. Someone had combined different substances. Someone had stored the result. That requires planning. And planning takes time. Imagine spending hours grinding a hard mineral into a fine powder while sitting beside a fire, with nowhere else you need to be. For us, that sounds tedious. For someone living in a world where daylight was precious and every journey carried risk, uninterrupted time could be valuable. Then there's something even more delicate. Sewing. Bone needles begin appearing in the archaeological record tens of thousands of years ago, including finds associated with Sibudu Cave in South Africa. These aren't simply sharpened pieces of bone. Some are tiny and carefully shaped, with eyes small enough to require patience and precision. You don't make something like that casually. You need steady hands. You need concentration. And you need time. Once you have a needle, an entirely new range of possibilities opens up. You can repair torn hides. You can make clothing that fits more closely to the body. You can create bags and containers. You can reinforce materials that would otherwise come apart. The needle represents more than a small technological improvement. It represents the ability to transform flexible materials into something far more useful. And long periods spent inside a shelter gave people the opportunity to do exactly that kind of painstaking work. Now here's where things get even more interesting. At Hohlfels Cave in Germany, archaeologists discovered a small ivory tool carved from mammoth tusk. It has multiple holes running through it and spiral grooves along its edges. Researchers eventually identified it as a tool associated with rope making. Plant fibers could be worked through the holes and twisted using the grooves to produce cordage. String. Rope. It sounds simple, but rope changes what humans can build. You can secure a spear point to a shaft. You can lash together parts of a shelter. You can create snares, traps, and nets. You can tie objects together and carry more than your hands alone could manage. Modern life makes cordage so ordinary that we barely think about it, but somebody had to figure out how to make it. And once again, the archaeological evidence points toward something important about human technology. Innovation doesn't always happen during dramatic moments. Sometimes it happens when nothing else is happening. While the rain falls outside, someone sits beside the fire and works out a better way to solve a problem. Then there's another problem humans have always tried to solve: comfort. At Sibudu Cave, archaeologists discovered layers of bedding made from sedges, rushes, and grasses. People weren't simply sleeping wherever they happened to collapse. They were creating sleeping surfaces. The bedding was periodically replaced, and some of the plant material included leaves associated with insect-repelling properties. Think about what that means. Thousands of years ago, people were modifying their environment to make life inside a shelter more comfortable. They weren't merely enduring the cave, they were improving it. A cold stone floor could become a sleeping mat. A dirty surface could be replaced. The shelter could be organized around the needs of the people living inside it. That distinction matters. Survival isn't only about avoiding death, it's also about making an environment more livable. And once the practical work was finished, something else could happen. People could create. At Chauvet Cave in southern France, archaeologists discovered some of the most remarkable prehistoric paintings ever found. Horses, lions, rhinos, mammoths, animals rendered in charcoal and ochre across the stone walls deep inside the cave. These paintings are more than 30,000 years old. And they aren't crude doodles. The artists demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of animal form and movement. Some figures appear to move across the walls. Others seem to turn, watch, or charge. Creating them required time. It required light. It required materials. And in some cases, it required traveling deep into the darkness of the cave. Why did people do it? We don't know for certain. That's the important part. We can study the paintings, the materials, the locations, and the techniques. But we can't ask the artists what they were thinking. Still, one possibility is worth considering. What if creativity flourished partly because humans sometimes had nothing else to do? Not because rain magically created art, but because enforced pauses created opportunities. When the weather prevented hunting, gathering, or traveling, there were suddenly hours available for things that might otherwise have been postponed. Chauvet isn't alone. Lascaux, Altamira, Sulawesi in Indonesia, where hand stencils and animal paintings date back at least 45,000 years. Caves across the world contain art created in environments where firelight was the only illumination. That doesn't prove that rain caused people to create art, but it raises an interesting possibility. Perhaps some of humanity's earliest creative traditions developed during the spaces between survival tasks. Maybe boredom wasn't always the enemy. Maybe it was an opening. And then there's something even more important than tools, clothing, bedding, or art. Conversation. In 2014, anthropologist Polly Wiesner published a study comparing daytime and nighttime conversations among the Jute-Hontsi people of the Kalahari Desert. During the day, conversations tended to be practical. People talked about work, resources, responsibilities, and where things were. At night, around the fire, the tone changed. Stories, myths, jokes, songs, memories. The fire didn't simply provide warmth and light. It created a social space where people could gather and interact. Rain could have intensified that same effect. When you're trapped inside for an entire day, maybe longer, you talk, you listen, you share, and what gets passed around isn't necessarily meaningless conversation. Knowledge can travel through people. One person knows where water can be found during the dry season. Another knows which plants are poisonous. Someone else knows how to identify an animal from the shape of its tracks. Another person remembers what to do after a snake bite. None of that knowledge requires a book. It requires someone who knows something and someone willing to listen. That makes storytelling more than entertainment. It becomes a survival technology. Knowledge moves from one mind to another through speech, demonstration, memory, and repetition. Rain simply gives people more time to do it. Some stories, however, go beyond practical knowledge. They explain the world. Why does rain come? Where does it go? Why does one season flood while another remains dry? Why does the sky change? Every culture has developed stories about natural forces. The Aboriginal Australians have traditions involving the rainbow serpent. Mesopotamian traditions associated rain and storms with powerful deities such as Enlil. Norse mythology includes Thor and his connection to thunder. The exact origins of individual stories are difficult to reconstruct, but the human impulse behind them is easy to recognize. When people sit together and watch something powerful happen in the natural world, they try to understand it. And stories are one of the oldest tools we have for making meaning. The oldest oral traditions that can be compared with geological events offer another glimpse of how powerful storytelling can be. Some Aboriginal Australian traditions preserve memories associated with landscapes and coastlines that changed thousands of years ago. Whether every detail can be reconstructed is another question. What matters here is the larger pattern. Knowledge can survive without writing. A story can carry information farther than a person can travel. A generation can teach the next generation something it never personally experienced. That makes rainy days more than interruptions. They can become moments of knowledge transfer. The experienced teach the young. The skilled teach the inexperienced. Someone discovers a better way to make rope, and the technique spreads. Someone learns how to recognize a useful plant, and that knowledge survives. The group becomes more capable because information is shared. Not despite the rain. Sometimes because the rain created the time to talk. But there's another twist. Rain wasn't always a problem. Sometimes, it was exactly what you needed. After a rainstorm, the ground becomes soft. And soft ground can reveal tracks. Fresh footprints become easier to read. You can determine what passed through an area, how large it was, and which direction it traveled. For a skilled tracker, that information could be incredibly valuable. Rain could also change where food was found. Mushrooms appear after rainfall. Wet soil can make some roots and tubers easier to dig. Insects emerge. In tropical environments, heavy rain can trigger termite activity and swarming. For people who knew what to look for, the landscape after a storm could become a temporary buffet. So rain didn't necessarily shut down the food supply. It changed it. The people who understood that change had an advantage. They knew that the world immediately after a storm wasn't the same world they had entered before it. Water was another obvious benefit. Rain could collect in rock depressions, leaves, and natural containers. Some rock shelters show evidence of people modifying their environments to make water collection easier. Instead of simply accepting what nature provided, humans could alter the landscape to make better use of it. And when the rain finally stopped, the world outside had changed. The ground was softer. Fresh water was available. Plants were responding. Tracks were easier to read. Animals had moved. The rain had interrupted one phase of survival, but it had prepared the landscape for another. So what did ancient humans do when it rained all day? They did almost everything that mattered. They kept the fire alive. They repaired the tools they would need for the next hunt. They sewed clothing that could protect them from the elements. They twisted fibers into cordage. They processed ochre. They replaced bedding. They sharpened blades. They fixed what was broken. And while they worked, they taught their children. When the practical tasks were finished, they talked. They told stories. They sang songs. They remembered people who were no longer there. They painted animals on stone walls deep beneath the earth. Then they waited. But they didn't necessarily wait passively. They waited with purpose. Because eventually the rain would stop. The clouds would break. The ground would soften. And the world outside would become useful again. Every tool they repaired represented preparation. Every skill they taught represented knowledge preserved. Every story they shared connected one generation to the next. Every painting left behind became evidence that humans had used their minds for something beyond immediate survival. And maybe that's the most interesting thing about ancient rain days. They weren't empty time. They were in-between time. The moments when humans couldn't do what they normally did forced them to do something else. To repair. To experiment. To teach. To talk. To imagine. To create. Modern life has made it possible for us to fill almost every empty moment. The instant we're bored, we reach for a screen. The moment we're waiting, we check a notification. Silence gets filled. Stillness gets interrupted. But ancient humans didn't have that option. Sometimes the weather simply told them to stop. And in that forced pause, they had something we rarely have now. Time. Time to sharpen a tool. Time to sew a hide. Time to make rope. Time to tell a story. Time to teach a child. Time to stare into a fire and think. Maybe that is why the history of humanity isn't only a story of what happened when we were moving. It's also a story of what happened when we had to stop. Because sometimes the most important things humans ever created began in the hours when there was nothing else left to do. They didn't simply endure the rain. They used the time it gave them. And when the sky finally cleared, they walked back outside better prepared for whatever came next.